In the last few weeks, it's gotten much colder here in Halifax. And something that often happens from me when it gets colder is that I I find myself spending less time outdoors. I'm taking fewer walks. And so in an attempt to mitigate that a little bit, I start doing a little bit more yoga. And maybe on the weekends I'll try to grab a yoga class down the street. So I've been noticing how those classes go. And of course, some of us have also been studying Keizan's instructions for Zazen. So I'm seeing everything through this Zazen lens. And I thought tonight I might offer a few words on the relationship between what we frame as Zen practice and what we understand as yoga practice. And I'm guessing that many people who are here tonight have either a little bit of knowledge of yoga practice or maybe a lot. But there may be also some people here who haven't really had the opportunity to dive into that. So I'll just set the stage a little bit. When you go through, and of course, a yoga class can take a lot of different forms. A yoga routine can take a lot of different forms, but there's a kind of an arc to it. Typically, I find there's a kind of loosening up thing that happens in the beginning. It might look like a lot of sun salutations. And then the bulk of the class might be the things that we think of as balance poses or the stretchy stuff, where you're really reaching to touch your toes, sometimes in simple ways, sometimes in ways that I can't even begin to do. Near the end of the class, there'll be something that's about stretching your back now that you've done all these poses that are about bending forward. So a bridge pose or something like that. And often it culminates in two poses. The first is what we think of as the yogi pose, which is the one that looks just like what we do in Zazen, almost. You sit in the full lotus. Instead of having your hands like this, usually your hands are out like this on your knees. Maybe your chin is tucked a little bit, but it's very familiar. And after breathing a little bit there in this way that again feels very familiar, then you move into corpse pose, Shavasana. And this can feel like a very peaceful transition. It can also be a moment when people laugh a little bit. If the class was really hard, if everybody's been working hard, finally they get permission, right? To just lie back. And they lie back and their legs are out and their hands are next to their body and they go, oh, this is corpse pose. And tonight I wanted to offer just what on the surface is a very simple observation, which is that when we look at the relationship between Zen and yoga, and the question often comes up, is there any yoga in Zen, or is there some deep connection there? And the flippant response usually is, well, yeah, of course there is, but we just do the one pose. I want to take one step beyond that tonight to point out that yes, we do just one pose, but it isn't Padmasana, this yogi pose. It looks like we're doing that. What we're really doing in Zazen is the corpse pose. I just want to unpack that a little bit. When I do yoga, I have, because I've been taught to have, I have in my mind, a kind of kind of platonic ideal of each pose. Right? I'm striving for something. If I'm standing and I'm trying to reach over and wrap my fingers around my big toes, for example, I understand that I'm approximating something that someone else, someone very flexible, very practiced, can do in a way that is closer to perfection. And I see that person in my mind a little bit. I've had the opportunity along the way to sometimes see these people in person, how they can reach something in the pose that I can't. So even as I'm doing it, even as it maybe feels good in my body, there's an awareness that there's a gap between what I'm accomplishing right now and what the pose is asking for. And this is true pose by pose by pose. In Shavasana, in the corpse pose, that isn't there. I've never had it suggested to me that someone could really do the corpse pose wrong. It has this feeling of release. It has a feeling of surrender. If you've been doing some sort of um, regulated or formulated kind of breathing throughout the rest of the routine, when you get to the corpse pose, when you get to the end, that's gone. You let that go and you just breathe in whatever way your body needs to breathe. You feel the total culmination of everything you just did, which was maybe relaxing or maybe exhausting. Maybe you're sweaty. You lie there on the floor and you look up at the ceiling and you take it in and you let it go. There's nothing to do. I look at that and I think about what it means to practice Zen, not just Zazen, but Zen. And I see how in Zazen, I think we're taught, sometimes explicitly, but sometimes by accident, to treat this physical practice of Zazen the way that I approach most yoga poses. Right? We're told hold our hands just like this, hold our backs just like this. We have an image in mind of what it looks like to do this just right. We have an image in mind of what it means to hold our posture just right, to breathe just right, to hold our mind just right. And then we measure the experience against that ideal, moment by moment by moment. In fact, for most of us, the only time that we're not measuring it against that ideal is when we drift away and forget that we're doing it at all. And then when we come back, we remember, oh, it's supposed to be just like this. Right? Because we're doing this returning. And in that returning is the gap. But if you've been reading along with me, Keizan's instructions for Zazen, you know that one of the first things that he says is he says, do nothing at all. Do nothing at all. He says this just a couple generations after Dogen says, don't fabricate a Buddha. We've talked about this idea of not fabricating a Buddha. We've talked about it many times. And again, if you're like me, you hear it and you take it in and you manage to kind of metabolize it on this philosophical level. You say, okay, okay, okay. I need to take this Buddha part out of it. Right? That's in the way. I'm not going to fabricate Buddha. And then we sit down on the cushion and we take this posture, and instead of fabricating Buddha, we fabricate Zazen. We do our impression of a Buddha sitting in Zazen. We build a kind of structure out of our bodies, knowing that this structure isn't maybe the best version of this structure, but it's an approximation. It's what we have today. At the end of Keizan's instructions for Zazen, he lands in this place where he says, be like a withered tree, be like cold ash. Both of these phrases references to being dead, to being past your own function, to being past doing anything at all. They're descriptions of what it is like to be on the other side, where we're no longer striving to make something just right, but in fact, we're allowing it to be as it is. And as I say this, I'm aware, as I'm sure you're aware, that this tension is always there. We can't talk our way out of it. When we practice Zen in the world, moment to moment, what are we doing? We're striving. Maybe we're taking up something broad like compassion and just saying, I'm going to bring compassion into the world. And if we have thought about compassion, if we have studied compassion, we understand that there is a kind of ideal of compassion. There's compassion in its deepest, broadest sense. And when I try to act with compassion, I'm not necessarily acting as a pure vehicle of it, but rather as an approximation of it. Asking myself, what does compassion look like right now? Right? And then trying to stretch that a little bit, push it a little bit, deepen it a little bit, trying to get a little bit closer to that ideal. Or maybe we get a little bit closer to this tradition where we're thinking about vow. And we're using that as our lens for encountering the world, freeing all beings, cutting through delusion, entering Dharma gates. And again, because it sounds so perfect, and it kind of is, we find ourselves stretching. And so part of what I want to say is that that's not a bad thing. That's natural and that's human. And it's humble. And it's a kind of acceptance of an invitation. My idea of compassion is a fantasy. If there's a version of compassion that is deeper than the compassion I've actually experienced, or more vast than the compassion I've actually experienced, then everything I'm doing in relationship to that is a little bit like play acting. Right? It's like when you get cast in the community play and your character has experiences you've never had. I was I was cast once in high school as someone who smoked, and I had to do all the the gestures. I had to carry this cigarette in my hand, and I remember all my castmates who did smoke. They would laugh at me, right? They kept pulling me aside, and they're like, "No, that's that's not how you hold a cigarette." And I would say, "No, no, no, I've seen you hold a cigarette. I know how to hold a cigarette." And they said, "No, that's not how you hold a cigarette if you really hold a cigarette." And they would say, "It's like this." And they'd show me, and then I would try to do it, right? And I would get a little bit closer. I could get closer, but I don't think I ever pulled it off. I was always pretending. But I was pretending in service of the character. I was pretending in service of the play. I was doing what I was supposed to do. When we try to express compassion, we're doing what we're supposed to do. When we try to rest and act from wisdom, we're doing what we're supposed to do. But it's exhausting because we're always a little bit lost and we're always aware of that gap. We come then to this practice of Zazen, and we have an opportunity, but I think we miss the opportunity because, again, we've been taught, and it makes so much sense. We've been taught that this practice of Zazen is the foundation of all that other work. It starts here. And so we use this as a place to generate that sense of action, that deliberateness, that intentionality, and we hold ourselves in that yogi pose, kind of tight, like a bow. When in fact, if we read Dogen, if we read Kazan, if we really listen to what people have been shouting at us over the centuries, it isn't quite like that. It isn't exactly that this practice is the foundation of the rest. It's the pose at the end. And so we do our work in the world, our messy, confused, lost work. We do our best. And then we come to Zazen. And just like in the corpse pose, we sit down and we just hold it and we just let it go. We treat Zazen as a project, but what I want to offer today is that there's a way of doing this, there's a way of approaching this in which Zazen is not the project. The rest of our lives is the project. Zazen is the expression of no project at all. It's the place where we relax. It's the place where, after all of our striving and trying to reach 1 inch further in service of the Dharma, in service of something true, we sit down and we say, oh, that softness, that openness, that receptivity, it isn't what we're taught, but it's what Dogen taught. It's what Kazan taught. And so I want to invite all of you who sit down in this posture, trying to hold it just right, and trying to hold your mind just right, and trying to breathe just right, to really consider what it might feel like to shift that energy elsewhere and to let go of the project here. To really allow for this to be a fruitional practice in which everything has already been accomplished, in which the routine is done, in which there is nothing left to do. I'll stop there.